welcome to the fourth Good Systems Smart Cities Talk series for this semester. Today we have Dr. Jeffrey Chan. He's an assistant professor in the Haas Cluster and DAI program at Singapore University of Technology and Design. He conducts research and teaching at the intersection of design, ethics, and cities. Recently, he has started to focus on mapping the ethical issues and challenges of social robotics in public spaces. He is also the author of 2 books, Urban Ethics in the Anthropocene and Sharing by Design. Thank you very much for taking your time to be with us today. We appreciate it. I'll hand the mic over. You should have sharing.
Thank you, Connor. Very good afternoon to the audience here in Texas, and I suppose a very good morning to those who are joining from the Singapore time zone. So allow me to share my screen and we can get going. Okay, I suppose you can see my screen. Let me minimize this.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, so let us begin then. I will try my best to complete what I have to say in 15 minutes, maybe a little bit more, but definitely not more than 20 minutes, so that we have about a good 10-15 minutes for Q&A. Yeah. Okay, so I will begin by saying that the idea behind this presentation came to me when I was working on the ethics of generative AI chatbots. It struck me then that the discussion was overwhelmingly focused on its inadequacies. For example, the large language models that are behind these chatbots hallucinates, or that people would tend to sort of misuse them or use them for malicious purposes. I think these are all legitimate issues. But far much less, I think, was said on issues connected to the form of the chatbot. So to say this differently, the specific form of the chatbot must presume the primacy of language. So of all the possible forms that are out there, the developers have determined that we should use language to interact with AI. This might seem like an obvious choice, but Norbert Wiener once suggested that commanding an AI armed with powerful weapons with the speech command attain victory is likely to result in total extermination. This is because foreseeably, this AI will have powerful natural language processing, however, without the intricacy of natural language understanding. We are unlikely to also know the full set of necessary conditions for morally acceptable victory beforehand, and therefore will not be able to specify them with any level of confidence. And because we are unlikely to be able to intervene until the dust has settled, we will be too late after the AI has actuated our command. So to say this in a more moderate but no less serious terms, a chatbot is a particular form that places a disproportionately large burden on our linguistic capabilities, and importantly also on our moral imagination. The greater the power of actuation by AI, and we know that this is the direction that it is heading with the multimodal and frontier LLM models that are out there, the greater this burden becomes and the more serious the consequences, where almost inevitably our language or our moral imagination will fail us at some point. So in this presentation, I'm interested to articulate this idea of form a little more, and in this process, wonder if there's such a thing as the good form. I leave it as an open question, which does what it was designed for, but however, without some of these blinders that I just described using the chatbot. 2 guiding questions guide this inquiry. The first is, how might we design, constrain, how might the way we design constrain or broaden our range of ethical responses, especially in interactions, situations where action is actually prioritized. Number 2, what is an analytical frame of ethics that is relevant for understanding the ethical roles of form? So even without having the answers at this point, the aim of these questions is not controversial. So first, we want forms that can broaden rather than narrow our range of responses that can result in a positive outcome, however this is defined. Second, we want to know how certain forms can limit ethical responses. And importantly, third, to make sense of these practical goals, we also need a frame of ethics that can take into account how individuals or groups interact with artifacts, especially when there is little time for deliberation and/or when we have delegated moral considerations to automated or autonomous artifacts. Here, I quickly define the terms used in this presentation. There are 3 different slides. This is the first one that discuss the terms of reference, of design ethics, right? So design ethics can be defined as a frame for thinking about the duties and ideals of design choices. So like all applied ethics, it has at least 3 different modalities, namely the normative, the descriptive, and the meta-ethical. But I think there's another category that is not easily squared away in any of these 3 modalities. But as, for example, assuming that there are some designers in this audience, we all know that design doesn't quite follow, or can be easily pigeonholed into any of these 3, right? And this category has something to do with the nature of how we congeal design ideals in a form that in turn impacts how we think and act with it in actual situations. In other words, what I'm trying to foreground here is that it constrains some of our action or possible lines of action. So this category becomes important when we concede that the characterization of an ethical issue or an ethical situation is rarely given. So in other words, we can't take it for granted. We are actually trying to figure things out. We are sense-making in situations which are saturated with lots of ethical significance. Yeah. So the appraisal comes about when we wrestle with the contingent situation where we consider what we can or cannot do with the resources and or affordances at hand. So in other words, where the form of the design actually plays a role in how we begin to appreciate the ethical situation. Following this, let us also define the term of reference of the good form. So here I follow Rittel, which, and I derive as a working definition of a good form is that which accomplishes what it was designed for without unintentionally constraining the possibility of ethical responses. The good form is therefore salient in urgent situations where an immediate response or decision is required. So this is very different from the other way of understanding ethics in which we are thinking in terms of a resolution. So a decision is required, an action is required, rather than a conviction or resolution of thinking about what to do. Yeah, okay. So following that, there remains, however, a no less important question that artifacts used in many emergency situations are deliberately designed to constrain interactions to what has been deemed safer by experts or more likely to result in a successful outcome. So for example, seen on the screen here, the ejection handle in fighter jets. There is no ambiguity that the handle is shaped with an affordance for pulling with both hands, and this is the only response allowed. So this reality of these heavily constrained artifacts open the question if there are different notions of the good form in different interaction settings. I have not sort of come to any conclusion on this yet. Maybe we leave this for discussion, yeah? But I think at the very least, the good form should still be one that does not introduce artificial blinders or harmful constraints. And this is my own working principle that arguably all notions of good form must share. So here we can make a distinction between a deliberative frame of ethics and a comportment frame of ethics. So you will hear me referring to the comportment frame quite a bit in this presentation and in our discussion, because I think this is a neglected frame of ethics that we have not really focused on, for the longest time. Yeah. So the detached frame on this is one that we tend to associate with ethics today. So we adopt this frame when we think about what we should or should not do. And in this particular frame, an ethical situation is transformed into a mental representation of symbols and weights, seen, for example, in the trolley problem on the screen. Would one, for example, choose to kill one in order to save 5 others by switching the track of the tram or the trolley? So, but in contrast, the comportment frame is far less common. It has to do with how we can respond to an ethical situation successfully without necessarily involving protracted deliberation using abstract symbols, weights, and principles. So these are situations where a decision rather than a resolution is required. And on this, I rely on Lobstrup's cited here distinction. So to give you an example, a news report some years back in Singapore described Mr. Chin here, the gentleman in the photo, who upon seeing a slow driving and erratic cab in front of him on the highway or the freeway, overtook this cab and deliberately forced it to crash into his car. It was later discovered that the cab driver had suffered a heart attack, and he was also accompanied by two fellow passengers, all who were saved from a more horrible accident, possibly more horrible accident, by Mr. Chin's selfless act. So Mr. Chin's intuitions about the situation quickly led to action. He responded quickly and successfully to the demands of the ethical situation without, protracted thinking about the ethics of the situation, converting them into a mental representation and deliberating about it. He led into action. That would be the way to the shorthand for describing this, right? So to return to the issue of the good form here, had Mr. Chin's car been designed differently, for example, in a kind of a full or quasi self-driving mode, perhaps without the steering wheel, it would have been, these design features would have likely influenced his response to this urgent situation. We can just let our imagination run wild, right? But we know that he could do what he did because, because the affordances of the car, a non-self-driving car could allow him to do it. So following this, now that we have sort of cleared, very quickly cleared the terms of references, to justify this inquiry, we have to ask the question, why is the good form important? I think there are at least two different kinds of answers. One is the procedural, yeah? So I think what the procedural does, what the procedural offers us is basically a reason or a justification that tells us that the good form is something that remains beyond our grasp in day-to-day design, right? So I think as a designer, it is possible to say that it is very difficult to arrive at a good form because we cannot rely on logic. Or if we were to follow Christopher Alexander, we may know everything that check the boxes of a good pawn, or a pawn that's sort of sustainable, or a pawn that is that is natural or beautiful. But putting all those facts together does not necessarily make that pawn good, for a very good simple reason, because some of these parameters may have mutual conflicts with each other, right? So how to attain a good pawn, or how to attain a good form, is something that is not yet made into a science yet, or not yet sort of made into a recipe or formula yet that we can follow easily, right? So I think that is the first reason why the good form is important, because it is still something that remains to be properly and systematically theorized. The second reason is actually substantive, which is, I think, the sort of the kernel of what we are interested in today, and is germane to our discussion. So all forms, in relation to our capabilities in the environment, present either perceived or physical affordances, sometimes both, right? And affordances is defined as the possible range of activities that one could do with the form, right? So following that, forms and their affordances become especially important when we are required to act without much deliberation, and when automated or autonomous artifacts are prefigured in ways that bypass significant moral considerations. So if we cannot stand back to deliberate, if there are automated or autonomous artifacts that preclude certain moral parameters or coerce certain lines of action, then the form is of utmost importance, because we are kind of left outside of the circuit of intervention. Yeah. So now we go to the examples that I promised in my abstract. These will be very quick, you can say quick and dirty examples. And the purpose of this is not to go into any conclusive discussion of the cases, but rather to use that as intuition pumps to lead us to think a little bit more about how good form and affordances can impinge on ethical responses. Yeah. So the first example is literally a pedestrian one. It's a design of one red button. We probably have all seen red buttons of this sort on escalators in public transportation stations and all that. Yeah. So despite the fact that this is a very highly evolved, highly developed social technical system, we still see quite a bit of accidents, also of a fairly high frequency of accidents reported or unreported on public escalators. Yeah. So in the event of an accident, members of the public or someone who is sort of walking by are counted on to halt the automated movement of the escalator, right? So clearly the question of a good form is of utmost importance here. Because time is of the essence. You do not want, for example, in this particular animation, you don't want the escalator to be still moving when the elderly person has already fallen down. So so design features or design decisions really of where this red button is placed, how big or visible it is, how many steps are required before it can be pushed. So does one have to break the glass? Does one have to lift the flap as in the Taiwan version, or in the Singapore version, does one have to sort of squat down and try to kind of very surgically pinpoint a particular button to press it, and so on and so forth? Who can access them? This all impinge on actually how much a member of the public who is an untrained person can respond to the situation and for a successful or positive outcome. Yeah. So this is the first example. The second one is actually a lot more grave. And on this, I do not have exclusive sources of information. I rely on whatever that's sort of published out there. And for all the obvious reasons, debates on the decision-making process of a nuclear counterstrike is sort of making a resurgence and becoming sort of a respectable topic on the dinner table, and of course in all the respectable renowned publications out there, such as the New York Times, the Financial Times, and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which within the span of a year have all covered topics related to the decision mechanism of deciding how and whether to sort of launch a counterstrike. So what I mean by a nuclear counterstrike means that a particular sovereignty has been attacked, or at least there were news that the missiles have been launched from another country, and that particular sovereign government has to decide whether they should and when they should launch the counterstrike. Yeah. So in this example, there is actually no red button, right? What we mean actually, or what these experts mean by a red button is in fact is more proverbial than actual. But what this means is that there is, at the end of the day, or the end of that very short process, a decision to be made whether to launch or not to launch the counterstrike, right? So since I'm sort of speaking to an audience in the United States, we will use POTUS. So in this situation, POTUS will have to deal, among many other things, with a set of salient challenges. So first, there is the whole idea on the accuracy of the intelligence. There's some indeterminacy and uncertainty with that. Following that, there is the hard moral problem of deciding on why one should perform the counterstrike. Certain pundits have said that actually the counterstrike is equivalent to a form of vengeance. It seems justifiable, but it is immoral. Yeah, because after all, this is taking it out on not only on the military of the other side, but also on the civilian population. Then there's this whole notion that POTUS will only come to the decision after deliberating with all his panel of ministers and aides, right? And according to the experts, who speaks first and what is going to be said has actually a great bearing on the formulation of the decision. So, for example, if POTUS was to start with an opinion, it is not likely that people would counteract it, yeah, because there was this whole respect and sort of for the position of the commander-in-chief. And there is this whole legacy constraints of a 15 minutes window to make the decision. This came really from the 60s, when the only option was to launch the counterstrike from land-based silos. Yeah, this was before the time when there were submarines or there were other ways of launching a second counterstrike. So a lot of people who are looking at this would say the 15 minutes window must go because we actually have other, or at least the United States of America have other means of launching the counterstrike. And most importantly of all, it says that actually the decision may come to rest on POTUS psychology or state of mind that day, right? So the design challenge really resides in designing a better form that does not skew the decision towards a default counterstrike. I think there is some consensus in this. And alarmingly, a simulation performed in Princeton University, reported in this article on Financial Times, showed that 90% of the participants chose to launch a counterstrike only because this was about doing something. And this seems a little bit grave when I read it, right? So this example illustrates that the form of this proverbial red button is not neutral. It can sway the nature of this existential decision independent of the intentions of those who decide. So even though Jean-Pierre Dupuy basically, I cited this particular citation, basically use this quote to refer to the nuclear bomb, but I think it is safe also to extend this to the decision mechanism or the choice architecture behind the decision of a counterstrike. So I come to my last example, and this is on the generative AI chatbot. So of all the possible forms that the generative AI can take, this technology now interacts with us through the chatbot, which means, again, to repeat, much will hinge on the written and spoken language. Yeah. So we will be constrained by what we can describe and express using language on top of our naturally limited foresight when issuing executive prompts. So Stuart Russell, a computer scientist from Berkeley, projected a near future scenario when we might ask the AI to de-acidify the ocean without any toxic byproduct and no harm to the fishes. Yeah. But according to Russell, to kind of finish, sort of draw out the implications of this thought experiment, the AI ended up consuming 1/4 of all oxygen on Earth, and all of us die a very slow and painful death, right? So in that sense, this is similar to Wiener's example of executing a command of attaining the victory earlier, right? Because the AI in Russell's example gave us exactly what we wish for, nothing more and nothing less. And this came with an unfortunate after effect, disastrous for everyone. So the AI powered chatbot is actually neither aligned to our values, nor can it be easily controlled by us once it has actuating powers across a wide spectrum of our daily routines. And I think this is basically where the chatbot, the whole enterprise or the whole social technical assemblage of the chatbot is heading at this moment, based on all the things that I'm reading today. Yeah. So allow me to quickly conclude. I conclude this presentation by summarizing, I think, the core arguments of this very short presentation. That number one, form can be designed without due recognition of properties or features that may constrain ethical responses. And following that, number two, this recognition is more apparent when one adopts the comportment frame of ethics, which is kind of underemphasized today in ethical discourse or in the way we intuitively understand ethics. And this particular comportment frame of ethics foreground action, which is solely required when our artifacts have become automated or have some quasi-autonomous capabilities. So thank you. With this, I conclude my presentation. Yeah. So I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chan. I appreciate your time and the fascinating presentation. I guess I'd like to open the floor to questions folks might have.
Sure.
Please go ahead.
Okay.
Well, I guess while folks think about things, I can sort of lead us off here and just sort of ask. So many of the folks in our lab come at this idea from an urban planning realm or sort of like a city design realm. And when we discuss generative AI tech and urban planning, it's often a very sort of theoretical, from a theoretical perspective, much less in practice. I think it's sort of interesting how when we move, like the example in the escalator idea, moving the big red button from a very theoretical discussion about how the button may sort of influence design to the practical, it sort of boils down to a very singular sort of sole item that does one very simple thing.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on how in cities and the generative AI and AI tech that people work with is often not so physical? It's not something necessarily you can press or something you might not even see. Do you have thoughts on how design choice plays a role when you don't actually sort of physically interact with items?
Right. This is a good question, and I think we can all speculate about how generative AI, or particularly through the interface of a chatbot, how that would be used in urban planning practices. I don't think this is in any way a widespread thing yet, because after all, we are at the very early stage of adopting this technology. But you are quite right to say that at the moment, at least based on what I've just said and what I've sort of shared, my focus is actually solely focused on a kind of a form of interactions that foreground the action and interaction between the user and an artifact, right? So when you are sort of saying that, okay, how does this actually apply to certain, to enhancing certain urban planning capabilities, foresight, or practices, you are probably, we will probably be stretching what we are saying today. Yeah, so it will be quite difficult at the moment, based on what I've just said, to kind of extrapolate or draw a line towards towards the sort of anticipated practices of how generative AI could be used. But let's say if I were to sort of think on the top of my mind, one of the things that might happen would be that we can, even though it's sort of intangible, we might be asking the generative AI chatbot to provide us with some anticipation or some predictive patterns of how certain places would be used or how certain resources will be consumed in order to make better and more accountable decisions as planners, right? And I think on that, the constraints here and the kind of affordances here would be basically priming our cognition with certain numbers that have been given to us by the AI, and it may unfairly bias our decisions later on after we have perhaps secured another source of data from the people that are on the ground and people that we've interviewed, people that sort of that we talk to. Yeah. So in a sense, we may, for example, because we may have a belief that the AI provides an unbiased source of information, we might be so primed that we perhaps may unfairly discriminate against information that are equally legitimate, but coming from sources which are perhaps at least ostensibly not, I suppose, not formal, not mathematical, and not statistical. Yeah. So that will be how I think the best I can answer that question. Very good question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do have a question. Thank you, Professor Chen, for this impressive presentation. But I know it could be some time difference, so it could be split in Singapore. So I really appreciate your presentations and your time.
No problem.
So, yeah, my point is, so currently we know the AI assisted in design is kind of popular around the design field, and I know there are a lot of professors and students that are working on developing kind of the functions or kind of package to help the designers for their work. While just my basic thinking is according to the empiricisms, well, we can only based on the things we have experienced, which means that there could be some issues we don't find right now, but there could be some issues in the future in our design things. So the first question is, could AI help us to reduce the possibility of these kind of issues in the future? My second question is, currently we know that the human in the loop that could be important criteria in the AI, right? But but still, human in the loop can be functionalized as kind of like the part in the AI. So I'm just thinking about whether in the future the designers or the developers think about to put human in the loop in the AI, like the fake or some like the conceptualize the human in the loop in the current package of functions. to improve the credibility of the AI design. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. So if I may iterate what you just asked, right? So the first question is basically about the predictive capabilities of the AI for factors that have not been known to us or is not foreseen. To what extent can AI do that, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So, and the second question is, I suppose, the purpose of putting a human in the loop or on the loop, right? Basically, a human governor that in some way can, can supervise some of the outputs of the AI and correct or provide human feedback if the output is sort of wary and all that. Okay, so the first question, I think it's an excellent question because after all, we are, one of the primary aims of the AI is that it is able to sort of collate, process, from a vast amounts of data to predict patterns and possibilities that escape the human cognition, right? Okay, but I think and on this clearly, I suppose I'm not from the I'm not sort of trained in a technical science of AI. I'm actually more interested in the social ethical dimensions of AI. So I speak with some technical limitations, based on my training as well. Yeah, but I will try my best to answer the question. So based on that, based on that, that open declaration of my limitations, I would say that the consensus out there is that AI is still learning from historical data. So you are expecting a technology that is very good in picking out unique correlations, unforeseen correlations, and some kind of adjacencies that the human mind cannot pick up from. But whatever that intricacy of the science is, it is still drawing from data that is historic in essence. Yeah. So I would say, and of course I'm open to to being refuted, but I would say with some level of significant confidence that at least foreseeably today, the AI cannot be expected to produce an output that is both accurate and I think germane or relevant to our aims. Yeah. So it may produce something that we have not seen before, but we cannot hope that it will be a bullseye to exactly what we are looking for the reason that first, it doesn't quite understand what it is sort of correlating. There's, in that sense, there is no criticality in what it's producing, number one. And number two, it is learning from some historic data, and I suppose through a statistical method, advanced statistical method, to derive or to sort of arrive at a output that we consider some future state of those data. Yeah. So a lot of things can be amiss. So it might look like it is predicting something new, but the newness might not be something that is very exacting to what we have. And that leads to the second question. We need to have some kind of a human supervision in order to evaluate it to see if it is something that it is significant or meaningful for us, right? So I think following that, I think based on my own, now I'm speaking from someone who is sort of looking at it from the social ethical point of view. I think by and large, today, we have actually and this is according to one of the pundits says, we have a self-correcting AI, but however, with one, there has no self-criticality. Yeah. So the criticality has to come from the human being. So I do think that today, especially in the breakneck speed that generative AI is developing, all the more we need some kind of a human supervision to not only look at the outputs, but also to look at the quality of the inputs, as I have sort of written in the previous article. So if the prompts are of immense importance and have great consequences, it has to be deliberated upon by people before you issue it, because once you issue it, the distance between the command and the output is, is diminishingly small. Yeah. And you don't want to sort of live with a result that you will regret. So the human on the loop, I think surprisingly, paradoxically, has become even more important today than before, right? So of course, if we go back to our interaction studies, we know that putting a human on the loop has other externalities as well. For example, it may introduce efficiencies, it may introduce friction, it may introduce unintended consequences, so on and so forth. But this is a risk we may have to take because of the incompleteness of the AI system. I hope I've answered your question. Yeah,
Yeah, definitely. You perfectly answered my question. Thank you so much.
welcome. Yeah.
Right. Well, if there are no more going once, going twice questions, I recognize. Thank you again. It is very late in Singapore, or very early. We appreciate your time.
No problem. Thank you for
Very,
the
very
opportunity.
much.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.